aspects of urgency and transition. If we look at the wider perspective, one of the scenarios we have now is that we can mitigate the situation in relation to the crisis that is now less favorable to us as humans, because it has become clear more than ever that we might not even maintain 1.5 degrees. The scenario, and with that, the current pledges of countries to mitigate climate change, we are all heading towards now 2.9 degrees in 2100. Now, these numbers can be found in the latest report of the IPCC or at Carbon Brief, which has all this statistical data. This means we are shifting towards harsher climate conditions, and with that, conflict. And with that, the need for harsher adaptation strategies and the clarion call for remuneration of developing countries through, for instance, a loss and damages fund, which is now established thanks to the efforts of the people of the last COP27 in Egypt. So the call for restitution is louder than ever. And as you might have noticed, restitution might be seen broader, or the idea of giving back might be seen broader, but we are having discussions about this. For instance, in relation to this organization, so I'll go back specifically. So to put the preconditions of artistic practice at the center of our thinking allows us to think whether such thing as, for instance, breadth of practice in terms of social geography, to be where we are not, or the living conditions, how do we live, eat, dwell together, allowing structures for families, remuneration, fair pay, etc., and food practices, housing conditions, etc., as a way of giving back, right? Is that a possibility? Is there such thing as restituting through the structures that we can build in the institutions that we have? This brings with that a sort of overcapacity. As you can see, in our latest round of applications, we received about 1,000 applications in the regular programs, 97 countries, and within our partner applications. So within the selected group, for instance, we can already count over 20 countries. So this means that in order to mitigate and then anything that we do within art and art institutional practice, design and fashion, in general, is to be related to this aspect of urgency and with that of transition, because with the broadening up of our geographies, it also reproduces the context that you find yourself in your countries here. The question of how to receive is at the center of that if it comes to a place like a residency. And how we work together and how we think together is important for what it does to that, how it taps into the larger perspective of practices, of what we can call cultural practice, right? We can broaden it up. So we need to ask ourselves, so what, and this is also in the statement, what would it mean to declare today a state of ecological and environmental emergency? Because we still haven't done that. None of the institutions have done that. We're talking about it, but none of us have stated that we are in an emergency. When we will stand up, when we will see this as it is, a crisis, a compendium of crises exacerbating one another, we need to acknowledge that we're in collapse. And we need to start thinking what it means to build a new world on top of its ruins. I'm just going to skip a few things because I want you to talk. Yeah. In general, it means that we need to rethink what art and artistic and art institutional practice is. We need to rethink its models in which the notions of artistic autonomy and institutional neutrality are held up high. We need to ask ourselves, what does urgency mean for our notion of what representation is? What is representation under the premise of urgency? What is the notion of aesthetics and aesthesis in this respect? And as Rolando so beautifully says in the interview that we have written for Onassis Foundation, which is due next year, With whose words do we speak? With whose ideas are we thinking the world? Whose ideas constitute our worldviews? Where do they originate? With whose eyes are we seeing? What are our ways of sensing the world in which we live? In which ways have we been made to experience reality? If we examine these questions carefully, we begin to realize that we are not sensing and experiencing the world in ways that relate to Earth and to others. Rather, we are living in bodies whose experiences are mediated by the dominant system, by modernity, coloniality, capitalism, and contemporary unity. So the epistemic and aesthetic territories of modernity become the limit of what we picture, sense, and ultimately comprehend. I want to give it to you, Rolando. You are a teacher and a thinker. Regularly, you give several keynotes, lectures on decoloniality in many academic and cultural institutions, more and more, art academies, lots of art academies. You are Associate Professor of Sociology and Cluster Chair at the University College of Utrecht. And since 2010, you co-direct with Rolando the annual Maria Lugones Decolonial Summer School, which is going to be due in June, this 2023. You're all invited for that. It's kind of a course. You also co-authored the report Let's Do Diversity, which is really a great report, and I have it, if you want it. I can make a copy for you. For the University of Amsterdam Diversity Commission. You're also the author of Vistas of Modernity, Decolonial Aesthesis, and the End of Contemporary, with Modernity, that published. So I'll give you the stage, and then after that, questions also. Thank you so much. Thank you. Are you okay?
Yes, no, it's fine. Yeah, you can hear me, right? Or not? No, it's fine. I think it's fine because I need to read as well. Hear me? Yeah. Okay. Okay, let me organize here my notes, otherwise I get lost. Okay. You can even hear me whispering, so it's good. Well, thank you, Hicham. Thank you so much for the invitation. I think Jan van Eyck become my home in many ways, and I'm really glad to be here with all of you. Thank you for the team. Thank you for Anne, who's always working a lot, Bruno, and the rest of the team. Also, welcome to the participants. I'm so much looking forward to meet you. Maybe not all, but hopefully yes. Well, thank you for the invitation to think a bit further. I think the questions of institutional change and restitution, I think it would be nice to keep them for our conversation. So I will push a little bit further the thinking we have been doing in conversation. And for this, tonight I will speak a bit more about the question of dwelling that you were speaking about, and in connection to restitution to some extent. So first I will speak about the time emergency that Hicham was already presenting. Then I will speak about our diagnosis of the Western model of civilization, what is going wrong and how that connects to this time of urgency, so the decolonial perspective on it. Then I move towards the question of dwelling more deeply. That is a very important question in philosophy and also in Western philosophy, but I think today with decolonial we can sit in a different angle. So that is the plan. I hope I won't take too much time, and that I will be able to make some sense. And of course, you are free to interrupt if you have questions in between, because we are also like in a conversational setting. Okay, so Hicham is speaking about the time of urgency, or the urgency of our times that we are living. And this has to do with what is today in the Western world understood as climate collapse. And of course, the time of urgency is very different when you see it from a global south perspective, because we might have the time of urgency started 500 years ago. An enterprise that made possible the centric model of civilization, because it is that model that put the human over the earth, that declared the human to be the owner of the earth, that is leading us directly to collapse. So one first question is, who is being conscious of urgency today, and who has been living in a state of urgency for the last 500 years? From those that have been living the destruction of their worlds, the destruction of their habitats, long, and on which our well-being has been built. Then, of course, I want to connect to the talk I gave last year, and to say that one of the basic contradictions of this model is its thought of the future, its premise of futurity, and a futurity that is associated with growth, for example, with capitalist growth, with infinite growth, used with the term contemporary. We always want to be close. That idea of an infinite futurity is also what is destroying the life of Earth, right? Because the life of Earth is finite, infinite. It's a futurity. So we have a model of thinking that the infinite, the endless growth in a world that has a life and that can die, right? So we are facing that condition of the death or the disappearance or the erasure of worlds through a model that is putting all its energy into the fiction of the future. These two are very closely associated, the cult of futurity with an actual loss of the future, and because what we are of the possibilities of the future. I think I've talked about this also here. It's very simple. I always explain it this way. Through extinction, the animals that have been extinct or the mountains that have been destroyed through mining, they are not coming back for any future possibilities. You cannot recycle mountain. You cannot create habitats anew of extinct species. So we are actually witnessing the loss of the future under a civilization that provides a future and endless growth. This is one of the big contradictions of the discourse in which we live and the reality we produce. We'll move now to speak a bit about how that model operates. It's a model that operates through dichotomies. Our friend and Elder explains it very well. And he says globalization has taken place at the expense of relational worlds. And this globalization is one characteristic or Western model of civilization, and is that it works through hierarchical dichotomies. Not a fluid duality, but hierarchical dichotomies. And some of them are fundamental to understand what we are living. So the first one is the human nature dichotomy, that is at the climate collapse or the destruction of Earth. And the human nature dichotomy that is so praised through the Enlightenment tradition, for example, and today through the logic of industry, for example, is based on the notion of anthropocentrism. So the Western model of civilization is anthropocentric. It puts the anthropos, the human, at the center. And it's a characteristic of this model, because if you look at First Nations and indigenous philosophies, none of them do that. For them, it's absurd to put the human above the earth that sustains the human, right? So anthropocentrism, that is based on the dichotomy human nature, leads us to earthlessness. Developing, that is the loss of the earth, the condition of the loss of earth. In that sense, I think when you were quoting some of the passages, we need to think how that expresses itself in ourselves. And I think we need to think, what does it mean to be an earthless self? How disconnected from earth, even though we are patently made of earth, right? Important element that I want to highlight next to anthropocentrism. Eurocentrism makes the West the center of the world, and this is the decolonial premise of Kedusel. Eurocentrism only exists in colonialism, because before the conquest of Americas, the West conquest of the Americas, without that, there is no Europe that can claim itself at the center of the world. Europe was in a plural world, right? It could not see itself as the center without conquering the Americas. So Eurocentrism is only possible through conquest. And one of its key mechanisms is the dichotomy between the self. Europe becomes the self. The other, up to this day, is those that are outside the West. The migrants, etc. And this Eurocentrism has led us to worldlessness, the loss of the diversity of worlds, of diversity of languages, of ways of eating, of dressing, of ways of sensing and experiencing the world, of being with Earth. Thirdly, I would like to emphasize a third element. Of course, there are many others, but for me, these are the key ones: anthropocentrism, and in the cultural world, we need to talk about contemporaneity. Contemporaneity leads towards the loss of memory, the loss of time. So we are used as amnesic selves, as people that are only living in the surface of an empty present. Yeah? It is not a deep present, like in some philosophies where the present is a deep experience of a spiritual relation, for example. Not the experience of contemporaneity, the experience of being in ephemeral present that is becomes this present. Yeah, it's a present without. Walter Benjamin will call it empty. Okay, so these are just a brief sketch of some of the ways of understanding how Western civilization produces us in separation. Maria Lugones is one of our elders and now ancestors in a way speaks in her analysis of the coloniality of gender, of how we have been made in separation. That's the violence of modernity, that we are produced as individual selves in separation. So in separation from what? So the earthless self, from diversity, the plurality of worlds, the world self, and memory, the self without memory, the amnesic self. the self that has no ancestrality. So, as I often mention, it is telling that the West, that has the museums and controls the narrative of world history or even comparative histories, or is a self that doesn't know who are our ancestors, right? Whereas in other philosophies, in other worlds of living, in relational worlds, people know who are their ancestors, who are their territories, where they come from. But being individual preparation is that you don't, is not necessary to actually you have been made not to know who you are as a historical subject. Yeah. So the place that claims the ownership of history is actually the place without memory, or it is an amnesic system. And temporal is important for it, or futurity. Let me go now to the question of dwelling. I will connect to these previous categories. So the question of dwelling, I think first, in this time, we need to ask the question of dwelling on Earth, but also with Earth. What does it mean, I think, to dwell with Earth? So who have we become? I think Hicham read an excerpt of this conversation where we were speaking about this. So what do we become? Who have we become when we see ourselves? Lens, like the worldless self, the earthless self, the amnesic self. So what is this individuality in which we have been made to be? In which bodies are we living? And this is the question of aesthesis. How aesthetics controls the way in which we sense and perceive the world. So who we become when we have been made owners of Earth? I think every time we go to a supermarket, especially here in the north, but also in the north of the south, we are practicing that being owners of Earth. We may be writing and criticizing the plantation or operation, but we do that. It is part of our system, incorporating our body, right? The corpus, the way of incorporating that system that fits us, and at the same time that we are incorporating the system by that action. Right? Even though we modify and criticizing the system, we are practicing it. It is embodied in us, right? So being on Earth, being consumers of Earth, earthless self becomes very tangible when we see how we dress, how we eat, for example. The living in this, in the anthropocentered, in the amnesic body, it is the living without relations. So we have been made to forget our relations. We forget, practically we forget who feeds us, where the food we eat every day comes from, who dresses us, who makes the clothes we are wearing, who makes the things we consume. We just forget it, right? And dare to live in the consciousness of it, in the face of who we are in relation to others. We are very content thinking of ourselves. But we are in very tangible and direct relations with other worlds, but we don't want to see what we are doing because we wouldn't like that image of ourselves. It's part of over that false innocence and ignorance of not knowing a social being. That's the question of positionality that I will come back towards the end. We need to position ourselves in those relations because we might not like who we see that is different from who we think we are, right? So we'll go back to this with the question of dwelling, because dwelling is dwelling with earth allows us to think about the difference of the notion of place, right? What does it mean dwelling and not owning earth, for example? And one of the things I want to describe, but I don't know where is the note, but doesn't matter, I will explain it, is how dwelling points towards a different way of being on earth, right? And it points towards a different notion of space. And let's separate these categories of place and space. And we can say that in a place is in relation to the territory, in relation to the seasons, for example. That would be dwelling, right? Social movements around Abya Yala, for example, in Latin America, are asking about the territory. They are defending territories. The thinkers in the feminist movement, Abya Yala, they are speaking about cuerpos territorio, bodies territory. And this is precisely what that we have ceased to be. Right? The body without earth, the earthless body, is the body that has no relation to territory anymore. We have made to be in spaces that are placeless, these spaces of abstraction. So, for example, the airport, the shopping mall, even the classroom, the white cube, the black box, right? These are all spaces without territory that could be transplanted anywhere. They are spaces of abstraction, and they come from an architecture of abstraction. So we did a program with our a collective of friends. It's called Sumil Mokhtan in Yucatan. And one of my students, Rita, wrote very beautifully when she came back that she was shocked being back on campus in a classroom without earth, without territory. And this violence of how we are separated from the earth that is sustaining us. Through the architecture, through this type of fireproof floors, it's a system, it's an amnestic system, it's a system of separation and of a sort of, how you call it, a hygienic system that is functioning to erase relations, the possibility of relating. Yeah. So when we ask the dwelling, we have to say, at least in our thought, that this dwelling with earth should look away from those placeless spaces, from that notion of the space as an abstraction where everything can fit and nothing. Like the shopping mall, you can sell any type of commodity. Cube, you can exhibit any type of art, is designed for that, etc., etc. The black box of the performing arts. In the talks I have with choreographers and dancers, I always ask this question: where is the earth in the canon of Western dance? In the black box, there is no earth, there is no soil, there is no territory. It is just the representation and the form. These are spaces of representation, of artifice, of abstraction. So the movement and the challenge here of dwelling is to enter a relation, to remember, like member back, put together our relation with the territory, for example, very concretely, with the seasons, the body without seasons. In one of my classes, we were reading about Chinese medicine, the ancient Chinese medicine, And they say very clearly the body is connected to the seasons and is experiencing a different corporality in every different season and has to eat different things, have a different rhythm, and that's part of being healthy. But that notion of health had to do with a deep relation with Earth. Whereas now being healthy is to have a systematic timetable for sleeping, eating the same things, through the supermarket, no matter if it's summer or fall or whatever it is, and in passing destroying the planet because we don't sense anymore that destruction because we are not connecting anymore, right? It is an abstraction. So when we read about CO2 or 1.5 degrees or 4 degrees, it's an abstraction. It has no aesthesis. We don't perceive it in our body because our bodies are in that space of abstraction. We might worry rationally, but we are not engaged because it's not moving us. And that's the very sad conditions of the separated self, that by losing our relations, we have been made indolent, incapable of feeling the suffering of others and the destruction of Earth in which we are implicated. And so we have lost the freedom of being moved by someone more than ourselves, or somebody more than ourselves. We have lost the freedom of becoming, using the phrase of Fred Moten, more than a single self, of becoming relational, of becoming plural, the freedom of compassion. We have lost all that condition of separation and indolence, which is a very poor condition. Maria Lugones was often the reduction of the how this dominant sovereign subject of Western civilization is a reduced being. It's a being that has lost its relations. That might be very powerful, but it's a very poor thing in terms of meaning and relations and capacities of sensing beyond the self. So I think with this we can say that we've forgotten that we are dwellers of Earth. Even today, the artifice of moving to space, for example, Hannah Arendt was already writing very beautifully in the preface of the Human Condition, this arrogance of thinking that we can dream ourselves without Earth and emancipate ourselves of the Earth, as if the Earth was a prison, when actually the Earth is the mother, is sustaining us. All our cells come from the Earth. Even any biologist can tell you that your cells are made of Earth. They have water, iron, etc. Right? But very concretely, it's not a belief, it's not a religion. It is a matter of fact. But still, we are thinking that we are ourselves going out of Earth somehow, right? By destroying Earth in the meantime. So the other side of that thought is this idea that has been denounced by many indigenous and First Nation thinkers, that it is an absurdity to think that there is more progress and more humanity the more we can exploit Earth. It is completely absurd because we are part of Earth. But that's the logic of the anthropocentric, Eurocentric civilization. Okay. So there is another thing about place and space that I wanted to think through with the question of dwelling. And it's in relation to the colonial difference. So the colonial difference is that fracture that there is between a modern world, the dominant model, and the world of loss that we call coloniality. So between the cult of progress and civilization and earthlessness and worthlessness, there is a big fracture. And that fracture causes that some people enjoy the artifice of life, we can call it enjoyment, parentheses, and other people are suffering, including earth beings are suffering the destruction that sustains that artificial life or that life separation. Because we are in separation, but we materially are actively consuming the planet. So materially, we are totally engaged in the consumption of the planet. But our consciousness, our sensing is separated from the planet. So I think it's one of the big dramas we are living today. So in this movement that I have explained before, maybe I can extend in the question and answers, not to be too long now. There is this disjunction between the placelessness of modernity or of contemporaneity, the placelessness of abstraction, the placelessness of the artifice or the simulation on the one hand, and on the other hand, the displacement of people from their territories, the displacement of earth being from their territories, the extraction, the mining, the destruction of mountains, of rivers, also earth beings, and the dispossession of other worlds. So we have, next to the placelessness we celebrate, the museum, the gallery, the white space, the shopping mall, the airport, we have the underside, that is a coloniality, that is the displacement, the extraction, the dispossession. The decolonial is a movement that aims towards undoing that displacement, that extraction, that dispossession, to fight for what I write in Vistas of Modernity, to fight for emplacement, to be able to take place again in the world, of those worlds that have been evicted from history, right? I think we were talking about Maroon very briefly before the talk, and I think the Maroon show in that history and in their philosophy that power of emplacement, of an emplacement that doesn't depend from the dominant structures and that claims a world for itself again. That is the decolonial. So the decolonial is not seeking to enter the placeless place of modernity. It's not that those that are suffering from extraction and dispossession will be liberated by entering the shopping mall and the airport. And many of them know now that those are the places of destruction. They don't want to become that. For them, liberation is not to become the subject that destroys the planet. Liberation is allowing the taking place of those worlds that care for life and that care for the world. And that's why the Zapatista struggle in Chiapas, they say very clearly, it's a struggle for life against death, because they are defending life. The defense of the territories is the defense of life, against extraction, against dispossession, for the construction of an artificial life, right? So this leads me towards, I don't know how. Okay. So this leads me towards a couple of more things I wanted to add to the conversation. And one that is connected to the question that Hicham was saying, what would it mean to give back to Earth what we have received from Earth? If we do this exercise of thinking, as we have been taught from a beautiful community we work with, what would it mean to give back to Earth what we have received from Earth? Do this exercise of thinking from being in the womb of our mothers to today, what we have received from Earth and what it would mean to give it back. I think for many of us that have been lived in separation and individualized and in the hyper-consumerist world, in the earthless world, it's an impossible task. Sadly, it becomes an impossible task. But there are other people in the world that give back to Earth, that nourish Earth, that care for Earth. And this is the deep meaning of dwelling. And also in agreement with some important philosophers like the famous of Heidegger on dwelling, says dwelling is about caring, right? independently of his political history. But there is a question of, because he finds this in language, he doesn't find it in his political thinking. He's looking at the Germanic roots and the Anglo-Saxon roots, because that's the languages he worked with, and he finds dwelling is about caring, right? And if we are dwellers of earth, it should mean that we are not conquerors of earth. We are not owners of earth, right? All these premises with which we live on as owners of private property, for example, or the state territory, the sovereignty over a territory, right? So in my essay, Vistas of Modernity, I speak about moving from owning the property logic to owing, to gratitude. What would it mean to move towards gratitude, towards the earth, towards cultivating earth, tending for the growth of life, towards a term used by indigenous scholars in North America, also in the north of Europe, towards a stewardship that in Latin America or Abya Yala we call the guardians of the earth, guardianes de la tierra, or del corazón de la tierra. So what would it be to be guardian, a steward, and not an owner of earth? And not preserve earth because it's property or because it is an asset or CO asset, but because we recognize that we don't own it, but we owe to earth all that we are, right? And this one of cultivating earth that is at the center of the struggle for territories, like our friends Valiana Aguilar and Angel Cu in Yucatan, teach us the struggle for the territory is first through cultivating the territory. And there you have the notion cultivating is the source of the term culture. So how is it possible that our notion of culture has become earthless? And in the first place, it's about caring and cultivating. Right? We have moved in the opposite direction. And we call culture what it is, unculturing or extracting. Right? And we have discussed this here at Jamfanike. What does it mean that artists practice their art in a notion of autonomy that presupposes that materials are readily available and that the mind of the human can just transform them into the shape they want, right? Without any relation to where the material or what the material means or what it is or what it says, right? So the dominance of form over cultivation, over caring, right? So, so the notion of body territory that we learned from indigenous struggles and indigenous feminisms and decolonial and communitarian feminisms is a notion that brings us close to this idea of how can we remember ourselves? If we have been dismembered and separated, how can we remember ourselves? And can we think of dwelling then as a verb and being a practice of relating back to communal self beyond the separation of worthlessness or the self and the other, of weaving us back to an ancestral consciousness, knowing that we all come from the womb of somebody, our mothers, and we all come from some forefathers, and we all come from some territories that we have made to forget. Weaving back to, in this relationality to earth. So instead, as I have said in one of my texts, instead of thinking of the cult of personhood, the ability of being a single person, or the domain over a single person, what would it mean to think of earthhood, of being of earth, of dwelling with earth? We move away from that idea of the Enlightenment anthropocentric that we need to become to achieve that personhood, to be fully humans. The same for ancestralhood, the same for communalhood. Can we change what we belong to and who, the consciousness of who we are? I think we are at that junction. And of course that, if dwelling is that practice of relationality, or we could define it as a practice of relationality, then of course it is in contrast or against the logic of separation, abstraction, of placelessness. So what is at stake in dwelling is this relational weave to earth, to community, to time, is the possibility of sustaining ourselves, not individually, communally, of nurturing the very possibility of relationality. That in turn makes dwelling possible. So dwelling is sustaining, nurturing, building relations, and that makes dwelling possible again. This is the logic of relationality. It's not a linear logic. So what is at stake is the hope of overcoming the world of separation, the being in separation, of safeguarding earth and plurality. What is at stake is the freedom that comes as peace from caring, safeguarding, cultivating the relations that sustain and transform us. I think those are, the things that the question of dwelling invites us to think today. Thank you.
You just take this mic.
This one. You want some water?
Maybe if there's already someone who wants to ask a question already, or
Nobody interrupted me.
no. You already had to. Okay, sorry. Thank you, Rolando. So maybe we should just sit here.
Now I don't see.
I hope we don't. You don't see anyone? Should we stand? We can stand if you like.
You can come closer. There are seats at the front.
Yeah, maybe if you want, we can have a conversation, because so many things have been said, and I suppose also they might feel or sound technical in a sense, and you use actually two sides, one of which sort of the lessness of things, the earthlessness, worldlessness, the thing that it's not, and the thing that it can be. I think that's really interesting, because it also offers us, in fact, whether it sounds as a critique, it offers us possibilities in the things that you say, and I think that's really great. And another thing that hit me hard is the idea of cultivation, in which you have culture. And that's what we sustain as cultural practitioners. So what would you say to us? We are here as cultural practitioners. First of all, in this idea of dwelling, we should not do it here in the auditorium. We should go out. We should be somewhere else. We should do it differently. How do we do this? How do we practice this in a different way? How do we? Yeah, that would be a question. Or maybe it's something that in the middle.
Well, for me it is, or I think on my side of things that I think it's important to say, but of course it's not the only thing, is that that when you think of cultural practice, you should think if that practice is furthering the colonial difference or undoing the colonial difference. Is my practice contributing to the destruction of the earth, to earthlessness, or it is giving back to earth? Is my practice contributing to the erasure of other worlds, or to the subsumption of other worlds as temporary, or is my practice undoing that colonial difference? So I think here the ethical guide is justice, and it's a difference for me. It is what I'm doing, right? Recognize. So I think it's a very hard question when we begin to see ourselves implicated in the destruction of earth and the destruction of worlds. And once we see ourselves implicated, we wake up beyond that false innocence where we think of ourselves just being good by default because we're doing good things in life. Yes, we might be doing good things, but when we see them in a positioned way, and this is the part I didn't mention, is the relation between dwelling and positionality, because to be positioned is to be in that truthful place where we are in relation to others and to earth. And to see ourselves positioned is not to see ourselves through our identity. Our identity, we have been made to fabricate it and make it very nice. But that's not who we are as social historical beings and as earth beings, etc. So when we see ourselves through positionality and also our practices, we might discover that we are actually implicated in the things we say we are not doing or that we are against. And I think that would be a start. And you can even do that in an auditorium. But hopefully, I think in discussions in architecture, this is a big topic, you know, how the architecture of modernity is one of separation, one of showing that we can be superior to the earth forces, etc., you know, instead of the vernacular architectures that exist all over the world, like the vernacular philosophies, where architecture is earthly, is relational, is ancestral, gives dignity, doesn't depend on the corporation, etc., etc. Right? Like with our friends that I was talking about, like the example of the Maya house, that is a deep relation to the territory, to the trees, to the bees that are kept in the house that reproduce that same territory, that produces the woods for the house, you know, this type of, and the notion of freedom that is practiced in that relation. So how can we change from an idea of liberty that is individual and liberty in artistic practices to a notion of freedom that is necessarily relational and political?
Yeah, exactly. Is there anyone who wants to already pose a question? Yes, yes.
Gracias, Rolando. I'm curious to know a little bit. Yeah, now I can see you. So I think there's this notion that coloniality was a project to destroy indigenous knowledge systems. And I think when you do a close look, it was quite the opposite. It was more a system of appropriating these knowledges through destroying the bodies and the territories where they emerged from. And I see this happening a lot now with particularly decolonial discourse in a lot of conferences and encounters that I've assisted over the last years, especially here in Europe, that it's become another catchword used and thrown very casually to legitimize certain practices, especially in art and technology. No, I think a lot of the Western mind has come to understand a lot of things through the use of these extractive technologies. No, like this microphone, these TVs composed of all these minerals extracted from the land. So I'm wondering how you have dealt with this sort of emplacement of the decolonial discourse as something that is being talked about more and more, while at the same time the extraction of resources and the destruction of ecosystems and bodies is sort of legitimized by this appropriation of the decoloniality as well.
Yes, thank you. Well, it's a very complex question. There are many things to say. I need another 40 minutes talk. But there's one element that I clearly recognize is that decoloniality is being used as it's like an ethnographic method beta, So suddenly the decolonial discourse begins use as a way to further appropriate the worlds, and under the logic of inclusion, but under the condition, I have actually written about this, under the condition of visibility. So as long as the Western publics understand everything, we will exhibit this and that, and that is a thing of appropriation, of incorporation, where the decolonial is instrumentalized for that. And with Edouard Glissant, we speak, using his ideas, we speak about the right to opacity. And we say, no, the West cannot understand everything. The West is a single world, and it's a world that is in a hard trouble to begin to know itself, because it only knows itself through itself. It means it's very ignorant of itself. So the moment the West begins learning who it is, who Europe is, through the eyes of the others that have been understanding the West from the outside, that is when the West begins to position itself and understand itself. So the right to opacity is fundamental in this thing. So what we see is decoloniality moving in various ways, becoming a fashion, being appropriated, but also creating deep questions. So, for example, in the college where I work, in UCU, the students are not any more happy with a curriculum that is only white or only male. And they raise questions because they have a different decolonial consciousness. And they know that if they want to become people that understands what's going on in the world, it is very limiting just to know a curriculum made on the West, by the West, right? So they are asking for this. So there are deep changes happening, even though there are mechanisms of appropriation, of incorporation, etc. And at the same time, there is the real erasure of other worlds. So in your question, yes, the West appropriated the materials and some of the knowledges, but by erasing and by denigrating. So I wrote an article many years ago on translation as erasure. So translation is not always dignifying. Translation can also destroy the worlds where things come from. And so, yeah, it is. I think I would like to, because I'm a teacher, so I would like to ask you to talk with the neighbor for 1 minute about the talk and then come back to conversation, because I know many people have things to say, but they don't dare to say it. So shall we do that? Is it okay? Okay. So could you just turn to the neighbor and
I have to find someone.
you can
How about online? Thank you. But this question of appropriation is in a sense interesting, but it's also something you will get quite fast and soon. People will drop this on the table, right? Because somehow it feels, because for me, decoloniality is not a singular fixed thing, no? I mean, we are talking about ethics, we are talking about justice in this sense. So, yeah, how do we circumvent this? How do we...
This is the question of ethics, no? That when the ethics is clear,
Yeah,
then you have an argument, then not everything can be decolonial.
yeah.
Even if you call your exhibition decolonial,
Yeah.
you call it decolonial doesn't make it decolonial if it is not addressing decolonial.
Yeah.
So the same for, I think, for reparation. It is very delicate the concept of reparation.
Mm.
enforcing it. And maybe it's doing both. And this is.
Yeah, I had something else because I was just you were mentioning the idea of CO2 and looking at the world through this premise the scientific, let's say, which is we talk at a certain point about this acceptance and mourning, accept it, because somehow I feel that because we are in this need of urgency, but it's a bit paradoxical in a sense because
That is very important, but that's where culture comes in. I think we need to sense it. Because if they say 2 or 6 degrees, it's an abstraction. Scientifically, it's very relevant, but for a politician and even another person, it's an abstraction. But when you sense that the earth is dying, like our friends that are indigenous people, then you act, you know? It's nice. Yeah, but you know, there is always, everybody has something to do.
but you know this kind of setting is not the right setting for this kind of thing, you know.
Oh, but it's nice, it's a start. Okay, let's come back so that we can go for for some. Drink afterwards before they close the building.
We have a key.
Let me stand so I can see people. No, it's good. Okay, this is the magic of relational pedagogy, is that there is so much to speak about. Who wants to? Okay.
So Dana and I, we started by, well, I think we were reflecting like how do you access this understanding and like the realization of the systems without lived experience and some sort of embodiment. And we were talking about our, personal experiences. Me being born in Brazil, but then living in Portugal, and then learning the history of Portugal and the history of Brazil through the lens of the colonizer. And then, so the decolonial discourse was definitely not in my curricula. And then going back to Brazil and understanding through the lived experience that the scars are still there, and then it's not like, it's something that goes beyond theory that I cannot put into words. And of course, I also don't access many other lived realities, which I don't embody or to which I don't have access to. So ultimately, and then maybe you can share your experience. But in the end, we were reflecting how maybe, people, the white male, cis male, which hold positions of power and which is maybe the most agency as a figure, can access this type of knowledge, assuming that this figure of power will not ultimately have this embodied experience and access. So how do you get it through? Yeah, but do you want to share your?
A little bit. Yes, we were reflecting on a conversation that we were having a couple of weeks ago, and I was born in Australia, and have lived here since I was 9. But then being back in Australia after 15 years maybe, and just like now having an education on coloniality, and then having that embodied experience of going back and actually seeing it in society there and not knowing how to deal with those feelings. I guess this was the conversation that we're having, like how to deal with that embodiment, but also how to deal with it if you have not had that experience and only know it through theory or these kind of conversations that happen in these contexts. Yeah, and maybe only I was just expressing a difficulty that I had there, like not being able to have that conversation, but only maybe feeling comfortable in a space like this when that is addressed now.
Can I ask you to pass the microphone? Just pass it from hand to hand. Whoever wants to stay with you.
You say something, or should I talk? We had kind of quick conversation about Edward Gleason, and when you mentioned white opacity, and we went through, well, this idea of if decolonizing practice has to be like a space of communication, and then we had to share some knowledge about practices or even terms of decolonizing, then maybe the oppressor, or like there is this thing like how to collaborate with an oppressor in a way, even if it's if the oppressor could be just a historical metaphor without going into the kind of guiltiness trip. Anyway, that's, but so how we could have this form of communication and how we could deal with the appropriation from the one we're trying to decolonize. Maybe I use the word spirit, but in a metaphorical way, less in another sense. So that's the echo of the usage of the right to opacity in our conversation.
Yeah, as you know, I'm from Ukraine. It's, your phrase that the defense of territory is the life against death, it's corresponded with me a lot. And we talked, sorry, I don't know your names. Mustafa. Yeah, he asked me if it's relative. Yeah, for me, yeah, it's relative, but maybe you can comment.
I think I'm a bit suspicious about it, about its relevance. And actually that was a potential question to you, because you mentioned the Batistas and their movement as they became very popular in the 90s, and they had their tournée last summer also in Europe. But yeah, I'm a bit curious and also suspicious about its relevance today with our, so to say, current epistemology, education, like all the modern institutions. Can we really reharvest this discourse? Can we really adopt it? Or our adoption will end up with another, so to say, appropriation of a discourse, and it also just redistributing it liberally, but actually not counting at the end.
Yeah. We're having some friction in communication, which actually just led us to find some common grounds, and finding it in like the locations of our body and where it goes and where it is now.
I'm having a very embodied experience of placelessness right now via jet lag. So I'd love to not have to talk. So I'm just gonna pass it on.
No, you first. No, I kind of want to echo Mustafa's question. I am wondering what you guys' thoughts are on that. I think it's kind of the question of, me and Ritu talked about your talk vis-a-vis what we heard last night and the kind of different approaches to this separation. We heard well, it's too much to get into, but yeah, I think that's the question: is what? Yes, yeah, is how are we meant to be addressing this massive contradiction of us being present here, and trying to bridge this separation, as you say, of the abstract space that we exist in. We're all like in an abstract space. I think that's the idea of the residency. And you kind of nodded a little bit at the end to how a practice of dwelling can just be about care and being in relationship to each other. But yeah, I'm wondering if there's more.
I thank you much, first of all, Rolando, and I'm really interested in the notion of healing the colonial wound, and in one of your texts you write that it's possible through finding the voice, and I'm curious on your opinion on maybe expanding more on it, and how would it be possible for the communities that has been historically silenced to find the voice, and yeah.
Yeah, we were talking about or questioning something you said anyway about if we are really disconnected to the earth and how, yeah, and that we don't know this connection, but actually we are connected and we don't realize it, that our body is telling us in several ways, for instance, that it's becoming summer, that it's becoming rainy, that it will snow. You hear a lot of people saying, oh yeah, I feel more uplifting, for instance, and then the sun is shining. Only we don't realize that that's maybe a connection. And yeah, so we were talking about about not so much not be connected, but not realizing that we are connected.
Yeah, if we think about climate change, right, and how climate change actually permeates our body, we eat microplastic, we breathe air pollution. It's just that we don't realize it because our time scales are different, right? But actually we are constantly immersed. And so perhaps modernity is a fiction. So it's actually and perhaps like the Decolonial project is something which exists already. And rather than, I wonder, I'm just thinking about this, like also in other context, whether rather than trying to build up something new, maybe we should just focus on the resistance, which is already existing nowadays. And yeah.
Hey, I just had not a question, I guess, just a remark, or no, just like I guess observation in relation to the word dwelling, because dwelling assumes some form of time, right? And our sort of relationship of time and the way time functions within the hyper-capitalist conditions is, I mean, it creates situations of like where epistemicide is pretty much thriving. And in that sense, how can we sort of reformulate our idea of time within that frame, and in that sense get to the idea of dwelling? Because I kind of feel like we don't have that much time to dwell, especially outside of specific, I say, geopolitical positions.
Yeah, so I guess we were kind of within the same zone as the question of Mustafa's, I believe, and in our conversation about the Yeah, what the urgency and the speed and like sitting here in this room and like especially as Hicham started the talk of when started to speak about the how like fast we should be here and it doesn't feel super fast sitting here in this room and then yeah we were just like speaking about like are we gonna like sit here and wait till it's gonna the whole situation gonna get worse or and then maybe yeah this is the question for you is about like how what kind of forms of more like radical action you are supporting and yeah and basically yeah like what's the how to be fast and how to act in this whole situation which gets worse already.
Listening to you, I am constantly reminded of Rabindranath Tagore's philosophy. I'm not sure if anyone is aware of it, but the way he understood the relationship between human nature and how both can collaborate to form a community together. I think I was constantly drawn to that philosophy where you collaborate with nature to bring the community rather than hold a power position. You collaborate with it. So everything starts like that. You celebrate seasons. You don't celebrate religion or anything else. You celebrate season, and then by that you understand the change you are going through. You know, you are close to earth. You learn sitting on earth, you know, experiencing earth. So yeah, I think that was something that's where I was going, yeah, listening to you.
No? I was just sharing some concept from my own language because I'm Taiwanese and speak Chinese, and because like in our language there's no differences between subjective and objective. Subject and object, sorry. So like when I say I love you and or like you love me, there's no difference between I and you. So when it comes to human centrism and European centrism, sometimes I would wonder if that could be this kind of, I think it's a terms of linguistic relativity, that language could somehow shape the mindsets of your idea related to the world. So I would say like maybe Chinese could be possible traced back to the idea of animism. So they don't have this kind of clear idea between inner parts or the other. So I wonder if that when we talk about this, but still in like English or like Western language, that could be a kind of limitation in this word. But also because you also mentioned about like healing and dwelling, and you also use Chinese medicine as an example. But like because we take in a lot of Chinese medicine since childhood, and I think in Chinese philosophy there's the idea of like inner universe and outer universe. So each one is kind of enclosed system of self. So it's kind of when I take in the medicine, it could be the exchange between two enclosed universe. So that leads to some, we could say like kind of extreme case. That when I want to be more smart, I would eat monkey brain, or I want to get a better liver, I'll just eat pig liver. So this is also another ways of Chinese medicine works. So yeah, this is some of my feedbacks. I don't know actually.
Concept, but it's only like, I don't know, I kind of pessimistic about it.
I want to thank you again for, especially for me, the beginning of your talk. Yeah, maybe it's because this month I'm really, my practice has narrowed to reciting children's book. But I think I never heard decolonialism explained in such delicacy. And yeah, it really felt like, although, the erasure and lost was, profound word, but it still was very, I don't know, caring still. And I want to ask, the title of this evening is Nana and Fashion, and I want to ask, where is the fashion? And what is, it's interesting, especially what you mentioned about architecture.
Rolando, can you take an online question, or should that be for later?
No, you can.
Maud, do you want to say something first? You don't have to, and then we can take it online, and then we can go.
I just wanted to share briefly, like, the question you posed at the end also to us. Like, do our practices, our artistic practices, contribute to this relationality with Earth, for example? I just wanted to say that it makes us feel extremely vulnerable at the moment, and doubt, and feeling responsible, and not really sure where that's heading to, but I'm very curious. Yeah.
Can we take from the online?
Okay, so Sofbu Bayer asked, well, first of all, thank you, Rolando, for your talk. You mentioned that aesthetics can become ways in which we control how we sense the world. With your thoughts on what materials mean and say and where they come from, and then how artistic practice can come to dominate these through form and process, I also wonder how perhaps shared spaces such as exhibitions, as we are also discussing this in the context of transforming institutions, so how exhibitions could look to render these notions in their aesthetics, in their physicality. There are, in a sense, a territory, how they may act as perhaps a testing ground for other ways of corporeality to sense beyond the self.
Yeah. Do you want me to sit next to you, or
Yes.
can I just?
It's a question to. Questions are for the both of us.
And the fashion thing will come to. I mean, this came out of the article that I mentioned for Onassis Foundation, where this is sort of a reader for the change in paradigms in cultural practices. This is for students. So art, design, fashion as categories are in there, but in the interview you can see that. But we can talk about it. Yeah.
Yes. Well, thank you so much. I think we are really running out of time, but it's really beautiful to have the participation of the whole audience instead of just waiting here for somebody to ask a question. And I will say a few things. Obviously, I cannot answer every question in minute detail, and I don't know how to answer every question, but I will say something that might connect a bit. And also, please help me to I think this is the question of embodiment that you started with. That I was telling Hicham, we hear 1.5 degrees, 2.2 degrees, 5.6 degrees. It's really a level of abstraction, you know. And people that are close to Earth in their communities, in their ways of living, they're sensing the pain of the Earth, destruction of the earth. It's really an embodied experience. Whereas we are in that space of abstraction where, okay, we know a number, but they could say 0.002 degrees, and that's urgent, and we might say, okay, that's what the scientists say, which is true, it's seriously scientific, but so for me that is one of the tasks of culture, how we translate that is proven scientifically into an experience. And I think that is the question of aesthesis, right? How can we go away from that indolence that is towards the suffering of others, but towards the suffering of earth as well, and how our bodies can connect back. I think the question of you back was that. I think you are right. The modernity is the artifice. We are made to believe that that is reality. But actually our bodies are sensing, and our bodies are made of earth, and that's reality that we don't live through that reality, right? So we don't have a body consciousness. We think through the mind, a mind of abstraction to self, and the things we know through the body, we don't put them rationally. They don't make part of what orients our everyday life, or our actions, or our teachings. So I think that is, what you were saying, but we sense the climate and it influences us. Yes, but the problem is that it's not taking as seriously as how we are made to think, for example, in separation. So how we move towards practices of thinking relationally that include the sensing thinking, el sentipensar, that is a very important concept in Abhyayala in Latin American thought as well. Of course, the methodology, so how can we do this? How can we reach out to the people that doesn't have the embodied experience, all that? Well, there are many efforts, and one that I think is important in the last 10 years here in the Netherlands is the question of decolonizing the university, that is also happening all over the world, in South Africa, in Mexico, in everywhere. Not everywhere, but it's happening in many places. And one of the things we have been working there collectively is in producing different methodologies. So the question is the method, how we do things. It's not just about what we say. If we just change all the titles and put the decolonial in front, it makes nothing. It is just doing the same thing with a different word. It is actually appropriating and mobilizing. So your question about the appropriation of the decolonial. But we could also not use the word decolonial and having decolonial pedagogies.
Mm-hmm.
That, you can read more about it in the book and in other documents in the diversity report, where, for example, we suggested the pedagogies of positionality. So instead of producing the abstract subject as artist or as professional, etc., the third person writer, what would it mean to ask all our students, as I do, to write from a position place, to have a truthful practice of what they are saying and doing. Who is writing? Where are you writing from? And that's more truthful than supposing a universal standpoint outside the text, that I'm writing about this, in an objective way. Well, that objective way for feminism and decolonial methodologies is false, because we are all placed somewhere. So you start from a place. So we go from...
This is what happened already.
Mm-hmm.
You were saying Brazilian, Portuguese, Australian. So this happened naturally as well, sort of.
Yes.
Is that place?
It's a beginning of that process. So instead of assuming a universal no place, that is what we are made to assume since kindergarten, basically, and what we are made to play when we visit the museum or when we are in the cinema, etc., to perform that. We say, no, the universal is false, it's an abstraction, but we don't go towards the relative, because the relative is also a sort of abstraction. We go to a position self, and a position self has more truthfulness, not the truth, but truthfulness, because she knows where she's writing from, to the extent that she knows her history, her material relations, and that is a truthful place of writing. And then what she says is more truthful than assuming a universal 0 point, or than saying relativism. that you can say anything or be any voice, depending on what you are doing. So the position self is also plural, so it's complex, but positionality is one of the pedagogies, and that includes the dominant subject. When you position the dominant subject goes towards a process that we call humbling, the process. And the dominant subject begins that they are not the same, that they don't know everything, etc. They benefit from privilege due to historical structures, etc. So they begin thinking differently also about themselves. So, for example, in pedagogies, in the classroom, in the university, this is happening, and you see it changes how things, how we think about practice. It's of enunciation that is plural, where the we sometimes is we as me included as perpetrator, as consuming the earth, but the we is also me being part of the decolonial voices. So I'm writing from a we that is not an imposed royal we, but is a consciousness that you are not a single self, and that everything that you think is through the voice of others. You didn't come to your language and to your ideas on your own. You would be completely unintelligible, right? Everything, every word you use, every idea you have is related to other people before you. And that is the we that I think changes the consciousness where we write from, instead of that forceful self of being an I.
And the he's in itself because it's masculine.
Yeah, using that convention because, so there are different conventions. One is just to balance and put 50-50, but because of the movement of coloniality being patriarchal as well,
right.
I normalize using the he for the dominant practices and the she for the liberatory or the responses to those dominant practices.
Okay.
It was just a matter of, it's not because of course it's...
But that's also part of pedagogy in a sense. It's sort of almost a technique.
Yes.
Okay.
And this has to do with the coming to voice that you were asking. And the action. So where is the action happening? Of course, the action, at least for us, is primarily happening in the territories, in the communities, in the people struggling to defend the territories and being killed in Brazil, in Mexico, etc. But Colombia. But we also say that we do have a responsibility where we are placed to deal other types of struggles. And the struggle here is the epistemic struggle, the aesthetic struggle, because the dominant aesthetics, the dominant epistemologies keep on functioning to silence other worlds and other voices. So if some people can struggle against those dominant systems, we can produce a coming to voice. So this is something very beautiful that happened in summer school when we had Professor Maria Lugones and Professor Gloria Becker talking together. And they both shared their experience going through PhDs in the US in the most prestigious institutions, one in anthropology, the other in philosophy, saying, my experience as a woman of color, I could not speak about it with the tools of the whole discipline of anthropology or of philosophy. And they both led this epistemic struggle and this aesthetic struggle, I would also say, to bring to voice their experience, to create concepts. And now many other women, and you can see the citations they have found voice through the work they have done. And they suffered a lot to open that space of speaking when they were silenced if they didn't use the dominant categories, the normative categories, the dominant method. Their struggle has opened a complete different scholarship today in those fields. And so that is an important struggle, even though it is not in the mountain or in the river. It is an important struggle because it is changing. It is fighting back the system that keeps on silencing the voice of those that have been silenced. Right? So the struggle is multi-level. Now, the mistake is to think that the academy or the academia is the center of the struggle or is the avant-garde. That is completely false. As I said, the deep struggle is in the communities that are being destroyed today and that are defending the last resources of the planet, etc. But we are accompanying that, trying to humble the dominant discursive systems, the dominant aesthetic systems that keep complicit with that violence. But we are not the vanguard or at the center of the struggle. And those people struggling in the communities, we always say it in the Decolonial Summer School, don't need decolonial theory. They don't need us to create a theory for them to know their struggle. No, they know their struggle very well. We are trying to translate what they teach us, how the territory, as I spoke today, to challenge the dominant way these institutions practice art or these institutions practice academia. So we are in that little space of translation, but of translation against erasure, I would say. But it's not, academia is not the center. So we are not with the idea of the organic intellectual of Gramsci or a Marx, that somebody in a desk can decide what the future of the world should be, a decolonial future. That's not decoloniality. Decoloniality looks towards the pluriversal, and the pluriversal is a world where many worlds can fit, and nobody can design it. Those are worlds that are contextual, that are positioned, that are grounded, that belong to histories and territories, and that have their languages, their practices. And that is the idea, that those worlds can exist. And for that, we need to humble and reduce the dominant world or its ability to destroy them. And there, the epistemic is an important struggle, the aesthetic is an important struggle, but they are not the most important struggles. So this is, I think, we also need to humble the academic position. The academic position is not at the top of the world. It's just accompanying and trying to translate and to bring those struggles to other areas that reproduce power.
Mm-hmm. So it is, in fact, very active. As Jonas said, why don't we just stand up now and start moving? You know, we are sitting, but it's super active, as you say.
Yeah, it has, I mean, it is committed and it is, but it is full of contradictions, and we live crossed by contradictions, right? So we also have to recognize that we are in contradiction. Like, I think everybody felt it. What are we doing in this room speaking of this? And that contradiction is something we have to stay with and not say, no, I'm perfect, I'm in a perfect institution and I'm pure, or something like that. Or, no, that is the contradiction that is crossing us and that we need to deal with, not to deny it. And that is who we are, that's our positionality, not our identity.
Yeah. I think I'm ready to just move towards the bar. Was the internet question a bit answered? Because I don't think so. Yeah. Sorry. Yeah. To move it back to culture, art practice,
well, the
extreme practice.
and the fashion. Yes. So one of the, at least me coming from the discipline, the academia, one of the things that has connected us so strongly with artists and cultural institutions is because what happened in the neoliberal system, at least that's my sociological reading, is that the university got hollowed out, got emptied from critical thinking, because no research in sociology will be financed for critical thinking. It will all become financed if it's functional for the state or for capitalism or for the corporation. And then they defunded everything that had to do with questioning. And I think also the young minds that wanted to question the world didn't find a space in the disciplines, but they still find it in the arts. So I think places like this bring together people that are questioning in a way that have lost that ability to a large extent in the university. There are places, but they are very scarce and endangered. And I think in the arts this is happening, and that's why working with the arts has this possibility of, and so exhibitions, and for example, the debates in fashion with the Research Collective for Decolonizing Fashion, for example, are very important, you know, and are topics that the universities lag behind seriously, at least in my perception. And so one example of fashion, for example, is that connects to this thing of dwelling and the earth. Well, and the time of dwelling was a very important question that will take me. But let me see if I can go through very quickly to it through the question of fashion. So, for example, there is this researcher in Mexico. I'm trying to recall the name of the, but it doesn't come to mind. But she did research on the First Nations and indigenous ways of dressing. That, of course, indigenous women are the first to know how to do it. But what was interesting about what she put down in her book is that the fashion of the Mesoamerican dress, so that this comes from colonial aesthetics or aesthesis, is the following. The principle is that they use the rectangular form that comes from the loom of the Hebrew loom, and they don't cut it. But that gesture for me is fundamental because they don't cut it because they respect the work that is before them of another woman that did fabric and the life that went into that fabric. So they don't have the right to sartorial right of just cutting and creating a form over the material. The matter carries a history of work that they respect, and all the shapes they do, which is very varied colors, etc., it's really big diversity, is based on this respect. So it's about folding this rectangle that is the relation to the other women that produce this fabric, you know? And that's completely in contradiction with the fashion industry that is about creating the form and cutting off whatever doesn't fit the ideal form as designed, or the logic of design as well, that has very little to do with the respect, the relational respect to how things have been produced or where they come from, and this consciousness in time, and that is the dwelling. The dwelling for me, and the notion of place, when we say it's relational, it is because it is a relation in time. The territory is ancestral, and that's what modernity doesn't understand. For modernity, the territory is just a space that you can put in a map and that you can sell, because it is just in the present. It's just an object in the present, and that is the logic of property. An object in the present is property, can be classified and made property. But an ancestral place cannot be made into an object of property. Who can own the ancestral territory? Nobody. We are part of it. We cannot own it. So dwelling has to do with entering that relation of the ancestral, which is a temporal consciousness, one that is not just in the now of property, but in the caring of the relation of what you have received and where you dwell, right? So it is a deeper temporal consciousness than that of one of capitalism.
But I think also the question of how to translate what we are talking about into tangible things, into exhibitions, as we try to do, into back in the base of where sort of the questions also come from. I think also that I don't think that's sort of answerable in a sense, because it's not about reaching that point of how to translate or how to represent, but it's moving beyond that in a sense, but also maybe to delay also. to, as you say, keep ourselves in that space of not knowing? Is that something that we could do? Because it's very hard to come up with a sort of an answer. I mean, we talk about that a lot, and it's very difficult for us to understand. So what do we do? How do we act? How do we perform? How do we show? How do we, you know?
Of looting and the loss of worlds, and to reveal who the white subject has been produced through this museum, you know? So for example, that would be an exercise in positionality, but other exhibitions can be about the relationality, about connecting to others. Others can be about transition, you know, about experimenting other ways of being, of doing.
Yeah.
So I think the methods and the orientation that I was mentioning in the talk, if we are reinforcing the colonial difference, if we are undoing it, that gives a lot of clarity. Also, when we are writing, for example, in many of us that our work is to write, the question is to whom I'm writing, you know? Who is the supposed reader? With which voice I'm writing? With which concept I'm writing? And if we ask those questions, we suddenly discover that we are writing, for example, for the white ear, or the white gaze, or the canon, or we are spending all our energy contesting the canon and not really doing what we really want to do, etc. So these type of questions are fundamental. For what? For whom? Is it undoing the colonial difference, or sustaining it? Is it profiting from it? And the methods, the ways of doing are very key.
We have many questions on the chat that we will not be able to address.
Could you copy them and put them in an email?
Exactly.
It would be nice to read them.
I will just reassure everyone who's watching, this will be copy pasted into an email to Rolando, and maybe you can answer. So if you want to send me, Bruno, directly your contacts, so we can reach out to you with your specific answer.
Yeah. I was just wondering when you were saying what decolonialism is. So there are, I was just thinking about some case studies while I was making my film on my colonial history. So isn't it, it's resonating like decolonialism, the term itself, isn't it an invention of modernity? Okay. It's like, because for me, there is, decolonialism is sort of like regaining my self-esteem. It's sort of my reclaiming my identity and recuperating my loss. But here, in this room, with my colleagues, isn't decolonialism is like sort of like coming from a guilt trip or something like that?
Well, it will take a bit long to answer, but let me say a couple of things. So different colonial histories have different understandings of colonialism and decoloniality is. So that is one thing that is important to mention. And because from Latin America, the term coloniality is not a European invention. So coloniality is Latin America as a conceptual understanding of what the global South is living in relation to the dominant paradigm of modernity. So coloniality is not a term invented by the Western academia. Colonialism is, but not coloniality. So coloniality shifts the epistemology and begins speaking from a different location. So that is, I think, very important in connection to your question. Of course, the struggle for justice and dignity, and that's why we also speak a lot about healing the colonial wound, is at the core of decoloniality. So, but then again, I mean, I didn't explain all these concepts in detail of how we use them, but again, for us, modernity is the imposition of a model of civilization that is constructed on coloniality, not on colonialism, but on coloniality, that is the erasure and the denigration of worlds. And then decoloniality is a response to that denigration and to that erasure. And that's why decoloniality is not decolonialism or post-colonialism, because it doesn't seek to become modern. Decoloniality is not saying, I want to be decolonized politically to be part of the modern Western world or to be included in modernity. Decoloniality says, no, the response is to delink, not to be modern. We don't want to be that has been constructed on erasure. We want to struggle against erasure towards a pluriversal alternative, towards many worlds. We don't want to be included in the dominant paradigm. So that is a different response from the historical movements of colonial liberation that were political movements to construct national states that vary in time from Latin America to Africa to Southeast Asia. But so the question of struggling against coloniality is ongoing today, and it is a recovery of dignity. It is often the question of mourning, of dealing with laws that is irretrievable, things that are lost, and how we can heal the colonial wound. That is the question. Part of it is coming to voice. Part of it, very importantly, is the struggle against oblivion, against forgetting. Because as Professor Ramos from South Africa told us once, if we don't forget, there is hope for justice. The moment we forget, and that's when we forget, when our aesthetics and our epistemology and our worldview is all Western-centered, because we are erased in that epistemology, that aesthetics. But if we do not forget, there is possible justice and hope. That might be through mourning or through healing. It's not about recovering a pure past, but it's about not forgetting and keeping the dignity and the possibility of being peoples, of being worlds, the recovering the possibility of being in history, having one history, right? What I was speaking, placement, struggling not to be evicted from the possibility of having your own world, your own music, your own world of sensing and meaning. That is the struggle for dignity, and that's where decolonial aesthesis is very important for us, because power not only circulated through the state or through capitalism, power also circulated through the bodies and through the control of aesthetics, through the control of how we sense and experience the world. So I think that is more or less my answer, and I think we agree, and what the discussion on decolonialism in Europe is very different, and it has to address the question of whiteness and the question of Eurocentrism, because there is no Europe without colonialism. This Europe that we have could not exist, could not have its power, but could also not have its sense of self without that is being the center of geography and now of history, the contemporary. Without colonialism, Europe could not claim, could not have constructed that image of itself. So decolonizing Europe is also very important in move towards humbling the power that keeps on silencing other perspectives, and still in the arts, performing arts and also visual arts and contemporary arts, we still have that hierarchy, the contemporary being the West. And whatever somebody is doing somewhere else is not contemporary, simply because it's not practiced in the West. So it is reproducing the colonial difference. And that's why it's so important that we are conscious in this type of institutions that were, I think, designed to further the colonial difference and to further the establishment of the West as a center of culture. That's why it's so important that in these institutions we begin showing those mechanisms and working against them, and hopefully functioning these institutions that were not designed for that, for decoloniality. People are participating in